Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Faith Unaltered and one of our favorites, Open Mic Night. Welcome, everybody, in the live chat. If you're here, sound off and let us know who you are. With me tonight is our friend from Real Seekers, Dale. How you doing tonight, bud?
Yeah, I'm doing great, Josh. Yeah, glad to be here. I think this is actually the first time that it's just been me and you on a show.
I think so. I think you're right about that. I hadn't thought about that until you just owned that. That's a good point.
There
We
we
got
go.
BJ and Sean in the chat. What's up, Saint Sean? And BJ has been a rather frequent listener. I appreciate him.
Yeah,
So tonight it's an open mic. So anybody that's got a topic or a question, feel free to start throwing those into the side chat. If you want to share this on your social media to help the audience grow a little bit, go ahead and do that. And if you'd like to jump on to be on screen with us, I would be more than happy to have you. And I'll leave a link for the invite to come in studio inside the chat here. So if anybody wants to join the chat, there it is.
Before they join. Okay, so we both posted it. Awesome. But yeah, or they're welcome to join. But I actually have a topic that I wanted to bring for you guys because it's very timely. Because as everyone knows, my friend Gary Habermas has just published Volume 1 of his great magnum opus on the resurrection of Jesus. And I had a couple of fans reach out to me kind of asking about a response video from a popular atheist YouTuber named Paulogia, who has kind of given a counter, kind of an attack on Gary's work on the minimal facts approach. And they've raised their own theory called the minimal witnesses approach. And he claims, Christians are too afraid to address that. So that's the first thing I wanted to do is kind of raise and address his minimal witnesses theory and why I think it's an utter failure on that front. So yeah, that's what we can do for I've got a bit of a presentation, but first I'll do is I'll share my screen. I'll just show like a clip from Paulogia, just so you can kind of get a sense of what he's saying. So is that showing up there?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear it?
It's not playing.
All right, let me just go back a bit. Is that showing up?
No, it's lagging. I can't hear it.
Okay, hang on. Let me share again.
I see BJ in the chat said he wants to try to come on tonight, but he doesn't know if his mic will work. You can hop on with a cell phone if you want to, bud. We're not picky.
Okay, so hopefully you guys will be able to hear the video. If you can't, just let me know and I'll pause it.
My objections to Gary and Gary's objections back to me. I'm going to use the exact phrasing from Gary.
You can hear it?
Yeah, we can hear that.
You can hear it?
Anybody in the side chat, let us know if the volume needs to go up or down if you can.
Jesus died due to the effects of Roman crucifixion. I'm just granting that for the sake of discussion. Numbers 2 and 3 together. The disciples afterward reported experiences that they thought were actually appearances by risen Jesus. And these experiences accounted for the disciples' lives becoming thoroughly transformed, even to the point of being willing to die for their belief. This is the heart of our disagreement. You see, Gary plays fast and loose with the word disciples. A scholar can agree with these two propositions. In fact, I could agree with these two propositions, thinking that there's evidence for maybe one or two disciples who reported experiences, and then Gary presents it to the public like scholars are granting him all 12. If I get scholars to agree with me on the statement that Americans fought in World War II, and then build some hypothesis on the notion that scholars agree that every single American alive fought in World War II, that would be disingenuous and fallacious. It is not in evidence that all 12 reported experiences of risen Jesus. As a matter of fact, we have no first-hand accounts from any of them on this front. We have one second-hand report of vague gospel agreement from Peter, and we can generously assume that that's synonymous with risen Jesus. But beyond that, for him or anyone else, it's just stories of stories of stories. And it is not in evidence that all 12 were transformed or willing to die for this belief. Again, there's some evidence for Peter, but not the rest. Thankfully, Sean will ask this question.
Here's where some debate comes in, that we have the testimony of Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, one of the accepted letters, 3 accounts in Acts, strong historical case can be made for this. Few people question Paul. Few people question Peter. We have multiple accounts of Peter singled and named out. But when it comes to the other 12, now they're just mentioned as a group, not mentioned as individuals. So how much confidence can we have in, say, James, the son of Zebedee, or Matthew, or Thaddeus, who's not specifically mentioned, and we don't have his direct eyewitness claim that he saw the risen Jesus?
I say 2 things. Number 1, the way I will nuance that claim of disciples' transformations, I will say, as far as we know and all the literature we have.
Okay.
But here's the more important one. There's 4 big names in the early research. You've named everybody but one in our talking here. Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, and John. They're the 4 most influential Christians probably of all time.
Gary admits he really has only 4 names: Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, and John. But remember that Paul and James each have their own separate facts, number 5 and number 6 on Gary's list. So the only 2 names he can attach to having experiences and being willing to die are Peter and John. Facts number 2 and 3 should actually read: Peter and John afterward reported these experiences that they thought were actually appearances by the risen Jesus, and these experiences accounted for Peter and John's lives becoming thoroughly transformed, even to the point of being willing to die for their belief. But
Okay, so that's sort of the first clip there, just to give you kind of an understanding of his theory, and he calls this the minimal witnesses hypothesis. Now, I have a response to it, but just before I do you have any clarifying questions, Josh, or on your end, or anything you want to say?
No, I
just
think
based
I
on
understood
his
his
clip?
I think I understood his objection. It seems to be mostly semantic, to try to make a reduction of what he thinks the weight of his case would be, to say, well, if you didn't have 12 or 500 individuals, but only 2 of them that were willing to die for this belief, then it's not as strong a foundation, perhaps. But I even if you had 2, I don't see that negates the point necessarily. So I'm not sure that I grasp if there's a bigger part of his objection, but I think I understand what we just watched.
I think, and so just to clarify, like, I think what his main objection is going to be, just in other parts of the video, because you haven't seen it, is so he's basically kind of using this of, well, look, we only have evidence that Peter and John, 2 of the 12, converted. So this is a problem for you Christians, because don't you rely on group appearances to refute the hallucination hypothesis?
I see.
Stuff like that. Yeah.
I see.
So yeah, just before I go into my kind of quick response, I see we have first last here. So
Yeah, welcome to the show. Can you hear us?
Yeah, hey.
Hey, how you doing, bud? Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Right
Is this
on.
the Praise I Am show?
Awesome. So yeah. So sorry first. I don't know if you have your own. Do you have your own independent question, or do you have something related to the
Well,
minimal witnesses?
no, I saw it was an open mic, and I thought I would join, but
Yeah, cool.
so yeah, I
no,
don't want to derail your topic.
Oh, no,
Yeah,
that's
no,
okay. We had an introductory topic just so that we have something to go off of. And if you have anything that you wanted to talk about that was separate or to add to what's going on right now, that's ultimately what we want to do, is try to
Well, I
get.
mean, the atheist objections, I mean, they just always cast doubt on everything. So I just find it's just I just don't like following their trails, because it's just you know, they just always cast doubt.
Well, the good news is, we do have, if you are convinced, because I've had a couple Christians who are worried about this theory from Paulogia. So yeah, I'll just very quickly present some counters that I've prepared here. So let me just bring that up on the slides. Let me know if that's showing up.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, full screen it. Okay, so yeah, so we have the minimal facts approach or the minimal witnesses approach. And just by way of an example, so here's Gary Habermas's minimal facts, right? So he's got about 6, or his extended list is a total of 12 minimal facts, right? So Jesus died by a crucifixion, he was buried in a private tomb or the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. The disciples were discouraged, bereaved, despondent afterwards. The tomb was found to be empty the Sunday afterwards. Fact 5, the disciples reported experiences that they thought were actually appearances of the risen Jesus. The teaching and proclamation of Jesus' resurrection and the subsequent appearances took place very early after the disciples' experiences. And lastly, these experiences accounted for the disciples' lives becoming thoroughly transformed, even to the point of them being willing to die for their belief. There are other facts there, but I think those are ones that are mostly relevant for what Paulogia is coming up with his list of facts and his theory, right? So Paulogia, just to summarize, he admits, look, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. I don't have a problem with that fact. But I am definitely disputing your next facts, because what happened, Jesus' disciples were despondent, and after the crucifixion, they all disappeared totally, and they're gone from human history, never to be heard from again, with one exception, the Apostle Peter. He had an experience which he says is kind of akin to a grief hallucination, and he interpreted that, or thought that was the risen Jesus. Then Peter goes to John, the Apostle John, and James, the brother of Jesus, and they don't have their own appearances, but Peter persuades them. He says, hey, I saw Jesus, and this causes them to be deluded, and they join Peter and start teaching Jesus rose from the dead and he's the Messiah, and Christianity got started. Years later, he admits Saul of Tarsus was a church persecutor, and he had a quote-unquote vision, which he thinks is caused by a post-traumatic stress disorder hallucination. And that caused Paul to believe in the risen Jesus, and he converted. And, the other facts, obviously, later on, the Gospels were made based on legendary material. But it's really the first 5 things that we'll look at here. So my way of assessing the minimal witnesses, in the first place, his theory, even if taken at face value, and I grant everything, he can't explain the empty tomb. So he has to deny that as a historical fact. And the problem is we have good evidence for the empty tomb. He also can't explain the appearance to the 500 in the 1 Corinthian Creed. He doesn't even attempt to explain that. And he has to deny the appearances to the women. But these are facts that are well attested, and they are even attested to by the skeptical or liberal scholars that Paulogia relies on, such as Dale Allison or Bart Ehrman. Even Bart Ehrman will admit that at least Mary Magdalene had an appearance of the risen Jesus. So, these are problematic elements. His theory can't even, in principle, explain these historically proven facts. In terms of the 2 skeptics, Paul and James, so he does give a full account of Paul. I do have some issues with him calling it a vision versus an appearance, because Paul is clear. The early church knows a distinction and difference between a resurrection appearance, which makes you an apostle and which were limited in time and stopped, versus visions, which any Christian could have at any time in subsequent history. So there is a distinction there. And on James, the brother of the Lord, he basically kind of gives a couple of objections to James, the brother of the Lord. And he basically says, well, we only have one source for this. We don't have multiple independent attestation for it. And and Gary comes back and says, actually, we do have multiple independent attestation, because it is attested to in the 1 Corinthians Creed that James had an appearance. It's also in the Gospel of It's also.
Oh no, I'm no, you're good. I'm listening. I'm good.
Oh, no worries. I'll try to be quicker too. And it's also in the Gospel of Hebrews, which I have to admit is a controversial move. So that's an interesting move by Gary. Other scholars like William Lynn Craig have come out and said they're a little bit more skeptical of using that. But this is one argument that Gary Habermas uses in his book. Also, another issue is, look, we know from the historical sources that James was originally skeptical, or at the very least ambivalent towards his brother and his ministry, right? He was not a fan or a follower of Jesus during his earthly ministry. And I would even argue up to the point of the cross, where, we have the scene between the beloved disciple and Mary that, this is your son. Why is Jesus going through this? Well, it's because the one who should actually be Mary's son, James, his own brother, flesh and blood brother, isn't there, suggesting he still doesn't believe in Jesus at that point. And it's because of that, and the fact that First Corinthians tells us that James had a resurrection appearance, that most scholars will say, well, most likely the reason James converted after Jesus' death, it's not what Paulogia says, that Peter was some master speaker and persuaded him that he really rose from the dead. Do you honestly think that James would be convinced when he witnesses miracles of Jesus and he still doesn't believe? He's not going to take some rustic fisherman's word for it. I think
Right.
most likely. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you. I was saying that sounds right. I don't know that Peter would be a professional orator or some sort of salesman extraordinaire. It seems like that's a special kind of
Special pleading right there. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And it's funny because at the 14-minute mark in Paulogia's thing, to save time, I won't play it, but he makes this big deal about this where Gary Habermas says, well, what was the reason James converted? Well, most likely because he had a resurrection appearance. That was the cause. And Paulogia, most likely, like he makes this big deal that's so ridiculous to make that conclusion when all we know is that James converted. It doesn't say, well, James converted because he had a resurrection appearance. But come on, put two and two together. He didn't believe in Jesus all the way up until his death. And we know for a fact he converts after his death. We know for a fact he had a resurrection appearance. What on earth would it have been that would have changed his mind? Well, it's probably he had a resurrection appearance, right? He wasn't persuaded by Peter the preacher or something like that. So,
Right.
yeah. Anything to say on that part before I move on? Or
No, it seems pretty straightforward. I think he's working on. I mean, I think he'd probably say the same thing about us, but it seems like he's basing this whole thing on a series of assumptions that he needs to make, let's say, rhetorically, compelling in some way. It's like, well, it might be, and you point out certain terms or phrases or something like that and kind of capitalize on it.
yeah,
It
he's
just seems
not
seems kind of cheap.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just because the Bible doesn't explicitly spell everything out. Well, James became a Christian after Jesus' death because he had a resurrection appearance. It doesn't have to be spelled out. You can put two and two together, right? I mean, he wasn't convinced by just preaching or even regular old miracles. It would take something very dramatic like a resurrection appearance to convince him. Okay, so then we have this other fascinating claim, the minimal witnesses, right? Look, according to him, and he's quoting Gary, we can only prove that 2 out of the 12, specifically Peter and John, were converted, right? Because James and Paul, they weren't members of the original 12. And with John, he was like James. He didn't have his own resurrection appearance. He was just persuaded by Peter. So really, Peter, we're just relying on one individual who had a resurrection appearance, and we can just dismiss that as a hallucination. I think this is totally ridiculous. In the first place, this theory directly contradicts the Gospel of John and its resurrection appearances, which does narrate that John himself had a resurrection appearance. He saw the risen Jesus with his own eyes. And there are very sound scholarly reasons for favoring that the Gospel of John was written by the Apostle John as an eyewitness. So that's the first response that Paulogia just dismisses over in his 20-minute video here, as though it's not out there in the scholarship. Also, think about it for a second. John was known as a stubborn and fiercely opinionated individual, right? Zebedee, son of thunder. Does this sound like someone who would just be meek and mild and just mindlessly follow whatever Peter says to do? Or would he have his own opinion? So that's another thing to think about there, right? And thirdly, most importantly, this is just total BS, because we can actually prove minimally 3 people, because don't forget, we have Acts of the Apostles talking about James, the son of Zebedee, not James, the brother of the Lord, but the brother of John here. And we know for a fact he didn't disappear in history, because here he is in Acts chapter 12 being killed by King Herod in about 42 to 44 AD. In fact, he was known as the first apostolic martyr in Christian history. So, actually, we can explicitly prove at least 3. And I would argue we can get to more of that, as more than just these 3. But I just wanted to point out that there are 3 explicit mentions in the historical documents. And it does seem that the reason for James' arrest was linked specifically to his Christian beliefs, because later on in Acts 12, it talks about how he wanted to arrest, after he saw the reaction of the Jews to the arrest of James here, he also wanted to arrest Peter. What is it these 2 had in common? Well, obviously their Christian belief in Jesus's resurrection.
Right.
So that makes sense. Now, another objection here is that Paulogia rejects the accounts of James, the son of Zebedee, because it's only recorded in one source, in Acts. And let me know on timing. Do you want me to play that clip, or it's only 1 minute, or should I?
We can play that clip. I actually have a comment from the chat here that I think is rather relevant. They said they were fishermen. Speaking of the disciples, they were probably heard a lot of fish tales that they didn't believe. I imagine them to be rather skeptical men. I think that's probably a good thing to point out, as we understand that people had a habit, or have a habit even now, of being, let's say, exaggerative or making up things and things like that. But I think this kind of falls back into the same objection that anyone would make to something like what Paulogia is saying here is, yeah, but you wouldn't die for something you knew that you were making up.
Yeah, and one thing I should clarify, because this Gary Habermas's minimal facts are more nuanced. He's not even arguing necessarily that we can prove the disciples did in fact die in all cases, but that they were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs.
Right. Fair enough.
Yeah. So it's even more nuanced. In this case, in James' case, we can prove he actually did die for his beliefs and stuff. But so the one of the other objections that he gives, and I won't play the clip just to save time, but he basically says, but this evidence for James just comes from Acts. That's one source. And he plays a clip out of context of Sean McDowell saying, oh, well, if it's only in one source, we don't have multiple independent attestation, then we should be more skeptical or something like that. It's down one notch in terms of how much we believe. And Paulogia takes this out of context to be saying, well, you see, if we only have one source, we should disbelieve it. It's not a historical fact. And I just want to say that's ridiculous. That's a misunderstanding of how the historical criteria of authenticity work. Look, these criteria are guidelines or indicators of truth. And the more indicators you have of truth, the more likely that fact is to be true. But it doesn't work in reverse. It's not like the lack of the fulfillment of one of these criteria proves that it's not true. The criteria don't work that way in reverse, right? Like, for example, the criterion of embarrassment. This is what we use to say that the women appearance is probably true, because it's embarrassing to have women as the first eyewitnesses to the most important event in human history, at least back in antiquity, because they were sexist, right? But it's not like, oh, well, if something's not embarrassing, that means it's false. It doesn't work that way. So Paulogia is playing a little footloose with how the historical criteria of authenticity are supposed to work.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I know about the, let's say, including embarrassing testimony, and that being something that adds to the trustworthiness or validity of something, because that's something that they even use, let's say, in modern courtrooms or evidence for a testimony for somebody who's making a police report or something, is that addition of an embarrassing testimony makes it more likely that they're telling the truth. Because why would you add that? It's kind of by definition discrediting, or as it's called, embarrassing or something. So there doesn't really seem, especially if you're going to say these guys were making up a legend and it was some grand game of telephone, why would that, of all the things, be crystallized as a permanent feature? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. And the point that I'm making here is that even the lack of fulfillment of, say, any criterion of authenticity. So let's say I tell you something, Josh, like I tell you, hey, I graduated with my master's in philosophy. That's not embarrassing to me at all. In fact, I'm proud of it. I'm proud. That was hard. That was a lot of work, and I'm proud that I earned that. But that doesn't mean that, well, it's not embarrassing, therefore it must be false that you have a master's. The criteria don't work in reverse. And that's what he's trying to do here. Is he's saying, well, if you only have one source, you don't have multiple sources, then it must be false. No, historians conclude that things are true based on one source all the time. All it means is we can rely on other criteria to authenticate certain facts in that single source. But it's not like, oh, well, because it's only found in one source, that means the information in there is actually false. I hope that makes sense, but
yeah,
that's my point there. You can't use it in reverse, and Paulogia is doing that.
There's one question in the chat that I think is probably relevant to what you're talking about right now, so I'll bring it up real quick.
Sure.
Brian here says, didn't Saint Jerome believe that Saint James, the brother of the Lord, is the same as Saint James, son of Alphaeus, and the apostle known as James the Less? I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know off the top of my head about Jerome and stuff, but I do know
Okay.
that there are differences in the lists of the 12 and that sort of thing, but they are the same people. So what I would recommend is, because I don't have it available to me right now, but Richard Bauckham, he has an entire chapter in his book on Jesus and the eyewitnesses where he goes into exquisite detail on all of the lists of the names of the 12 disciples and how we reconcile any differences and how we make sense of that. So yeah, that's the best I can do on the spot with that, but hopefully that'll help. Yeah. Okay. So basically what I've given you guys so far is, okay, but we can prove that at least 3 of the 12, but how do we go to all of the 12? Or in my case, when I was arguing for the resurrection, my argument, I didn't have to prove that all of the 12 disciples had resurrection appearances. It was sufficient so long as I could say that most of them, 6 out of the 11, because remember, the Judas is dead. So 6 out of the 11, if I could prove 6 out of the 11 had a resurrection appearance, that was sufficient for my argument. So I didn't necessarily even have to prove that all of them did it. But if we do want to prove that a majority and or all of the 12 did in fact have resurrection appearances, obviously we can get into information such as, well, what were the criteria for being an apostle in the first place? Whether you were a member of the 12 or not, you had to have a resurrection appearance. And since it's clear that in the early church they separated out these 12, and we can prove that these were linked to Jesus' ministry. They were specially designated before Jesus died on the cross. It makes most sense that they would be, and in terms of the records, everything supports that. Yes, they never recanted. They stayed a part of the 12. They believed in the resurrection as apostles and were continuing on in the ministry. We have no records or evidence at all that says any one of them outside of Judas recanted or that they disappeared from history. That this just doesn't make sense, because we would, number one, if even one of them did recant, I would argue we would expect to have evidence, just as we have with Judas, right? They need to explain, Judas did this and this is why he did this, or kind of make sense of it. So if Thomas recanted, you think that, like, he just went off to Galilee, Peter came back to Galilee and told them, hey, I saw the risen Jesus. Thomas said, get out of here, Peter. That would be preserved. We would expect that to be preserved and explained away in some way as to why one, or in the case of Paulogia, he's saying all of the members of the 12, with the exception of Peter and John, just renounced Jesus after his death. That would have been preserved. We would expect some historical evidence in some form to account.
Especially by the people who are the enemy of Christ at this point. You would think that they would really want to capitalize on that and say, look, your own people have jumped ship. Like, why are you still doing this? Don't you see, like, you're on the losing end of the stick here? I feel like that would have been something really quickly capitalized on.
Exactly. And Paulogia, he relies on this like historically implausible notion that the disciples, they dispersed. They just quote unquote disappeared from history. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. People don't disappear like magicians in real life. They would have went back to Galilee. They would have been known as disciples of Jesus. Peter would have went back to find them and tell them his message and stuff. They don't just disappear like a magician. So it would have been impossible to hide the fact that these guys recanted Jesus and never supported Peter in his resurrection preaching, or John in his resurrection preaching. So that's just historically implausible. This notion that, well, all of the other members of the 12 just disappeared as though they snapped their fingers and ended up in the United States or something like that. That can't be true, right? And then my final little critique here is based on a scientific, or more specifically, sociological or psychological standpoint, right?
Okay.
And it comes from the fact that, okay, so let's just take Paulogia's theory, right? So Peter had a grief hallucination, and in terms of convincing John and the other apostles, it was all based on him just reasoning with these people. Nobody else had their own appearance. Now, what was the nature of the claimed resurrection appearances that Peter supposedly had? Well, it was totally countercultural. It was against expectations. And we know scientifically and medically that typically 9 times out of 10, hallucinations have to be consistent with our prior background knowledge and experience and cultural expectations, our sociological expectations and that sort of thing. Very, very rarely do we ever experience something that's counter to that, although there are some rare cases. However, when you add in the social dynamic, so people like skeptics like Paulogia, they love to play this social contagion thing against Christians, right? They'll say, oh, well, Peter had this appearance and we have mass hysteria. So he managed to convince them and they all had he caused them to have their own hallucinations, like the Salem witch trial. And they use the social contagion aspect against Christians. And we can provide a response. I'm going to play a clip from Dr. Joseph Bergeron, a medical expert, countering that. But Paulogia's theory is different. And I think there's a different critique here because he's saying, no, only Peter had a hallucination. And then he told the others about his hallucination. Well, scientifically and medically, we know that if that were the case, then what would happen is Peter would lose his belief in the countercultural resurrection. When people hallucinate as an individual and they tell people in a social setting where there's a strong social connection and respect for the other person, and in this case, he's being ganged up on by everyone else saying, well, I never saw Jesus. So Peter's coming saying, hey, I saw Jesus. He rose individually before the end of the world, unlike our Jewish beliefs. And he rose and he was in a mundane form. He didn't rise gloriously. He wasn't shining like an angel or dressed in all white or something like that. That's what the Jews expected the resurrection body appearance to be like. But no, he just appeared like you or me, right in front of my eyes. It was mundane. If Peter presented these countercultural or counter expectation views based on his hallucination to the other apostles, they would talk him out of it and say, Peter, you're an idiot. This isn't true. That's BS. Look, the Bible tells us he's got to raise gloriously, the Son of Man in the clouds of heaven. He'll be glorious. And he's not going to rise by himself. Everyone will rise at the end of the world. And scientifically, we know that people that hallucinate as individuals and receive social pressure always back down. They always come and say, yeah, you're right. I was dreaming. I don't know what I was talking about. But if Paulogia is right, no, Peter was the one person in human history is, no, I'm sticking to it. And in fact, I'm convincing you guys. Look, I got John and James and Paul, they're all joining my side now, kind of thing. That's just counter to what the medical evidence says in situations like what Paulogia is speculating here. And yeah, I think that's kind of my main point. And like I said, I have a video with Joseph Bergeron where he attacks the other end, where he's talking about mass hallucinations. Those are just medically impossible. They don't happen, and there are issues with that. I'll leave it up to Josh if he wants me to play that clip later on. But before I go, the last slide, just a little bit of salesmanship for my friend Gary Habermas. And his new book is available on Amazon, Volume 1, On the Resurrection, Volume 1, Evidences. It's about 1,400 pages worth of great content. So, yeah, if you can afford it, please support him and see what the evidence says. Don't go to people like Paulogia and watch a 20-minute video clip and think that you can refute the resurrection. It doesn't work that way. Sorry, skeptics. But yeah, that's my case. So thanks for listening.
Right on. That was awesome, man. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. That
No
was
worries.
actually I haven't listened to, or let's say bothered with, anything from Paulogia in probably a year and a half or something. So I'm not even sure what train he's on right now. But if he's coming back to objecting to resurrection claims, I have a feeling that I think at this point he's probably, I don't want to be uncharitable, but I feel like he's probably just tugging along a trend so that he can continue having the notoriety of his channel, because it doesn't seem like he's gone anywhere.
Yeah, he's kind of just capitalizing in this case, capitalizing on Gary's hard work for 14 years, working 70 hours a week. He's put in extensive research into this 4-volume magnum opus, right? And so he admits in the video he hasn't even read it yet, but he's already making videos critiquing it and stuff like that. So I think you should read it first, at least read it first, so you can say I have an informed understanding of why he's wrong and everything about, that goes into what Gary's saying, because it's easy to take a 1-minute clip and just use that to critique someone.
Right. And I mean, it's not like like clip mining is a new thing either. Like people have been doing this for quite some time, but it seems to really work. Like, kudos for him for knowing how to play the YouTube algorithm game. But yeah, I can't say I'm impressed. Yeah, I'm not. I'll pull a Matt Dillahunty. I'm not convinced.
There you go. Out of curiosity, what is your take on his main objection is just trying to say, like, look, you don't have direct proof that all 12 had an appearance necessarily. Maybe it was 7 or 8 or something. Like, what's your take on that main hypothesis of his?
I mean, in general, if I'm looking at it as far as like consistency, or if let's say I'm pretending the courtroom scenario, I need to find the validity or reliability of a witness testimony. I wouldn't be discrediting the testimony of 2 because 10 of them didn't have identical testimonies. That's not really how this works to begin with. But also, like I think one of the crucial points that you had pointed out, and I don't want to gloss over it, I think it's probably the main point, is that the early church was very stringent about this. They wouldn't have acknowledged someone as an apostle without the qualification of having seen the risen Christ. That is an explicit qualification for being called an apostle in the tradition. So there's no reason to think that the early church would have been so lax or duped into thinking that these men who, if Paulogia's theory is right, that they not only weren't witnesses, but were just kind of haphazardly agreeing with Peter. Like, I don't see that even maps historically. But I honestly don't see the strength that he thinks his case has. It just, even 2 people, even if you had 2 people out of 12 that were like, no, we saw him, he's alive, and they functionally were able to, simply by means of maintaining their story, convince not only the men that were there who didn't see him alive, but loads of other people who were rather irrelevant to their group, like they weren't even in the in group. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
like you said, there's so many things that you wouldn't the first century Jewish mind would not have expected this to have taken place in the way that Peter explains it, and their first inclination would not have been, oh, you must be right because you seem convinced of yourself. I just don't buy it.
Yeah. What, out of curiosity, what did you make? And I'll get first last opinion too. But like, what did you make of this take about how I say that at the very least it had to be a majority of the 12 kind of thing because of the social contagion issue, right? I'm kind of reversing this. Skeptics like to use it, but when it, they like, for example, if the majority of apostles had an appearance or a hallucination for the sake of argument, well, I can see how the majority might lead to a social contagion and maybe the others would kind of follow along because of that social pressure. But under Paulogia's thing, it's the opposite. You have one person standing up against everybody saying, no, this isn't the way it should be. I just don't think it would get off the ground because Peter would be instantly fold. And that is typically what happens with individuals who hallucinate when we study them. When that social pressure or contagion is applied, it's not the one person convincing the majority; it's the opposite way. So that's how I would say you have to prove it's a majority or even all.
I mean, to be fair, there is, let's say, the long-standing kind of position that Peter, James, and John seem to be in as the core three disciples. And so the testimony of those in a social contagion environment would probably be convincing, except for the fact that what they were describing would be at odds with the expectation of the first century Jewish mind. And like you said, would have been immediately a challenge rather than like oh, that makes sense. Like, no, it wouldn't have made sense off top. And I don't think that any of the disciples, being aware of the fact that Jesus had died in a torturous and horrendous way, would have been quick to be like, yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, Thomas is a perfect example of this. Thomas was not there when Jesus appeared the first time because he wasn't there for the disciples to begin with. He was there for Jesus, and Jesus was just violently ripped away from him. And so why would he be there? He's like, I'm not here for you guys. I was never here for you guys. You guys can go do your thing, go back to fishing. I'm done. I'm done. And then they tell him, we saw him, he's alive, and his first inclination is, I don't want to hear that. I need him to come to me. I'm not listening to you. I don't care what you saw. That's not my problem. I'm done with this. Unless he shows me, I don't care. But it was compelling enough that he was there for the second appearance. So he didn't leave. So to his credit, there was something like a curiosity or an interest sparked that was like a what if. But I am not convinced that Thomas was convinced enough to make up a second appearance story.
And
you know what I mean?
That's one thing too. When it comes to Thomas specifically, because when I was doing my religious research, Sean McDowell was very kind, and he sent me some chapters from his PhD work. And basically, he specialized in the evidence for the martyrdom of the apostles and whether we have it or not. And Thomas was one of the ones that convinced both me and him that, yeah, probably we can prove Thomas was martyred for his faith and stuff like that. So that, yeah, the fact that you brought up Thomas, that's something interesting there. But yeah, I'll first last, do you have anything to say on this, the presentation, or this minimal witnesses theory?
Or well, no.
All right, fair enough.
Okay.
All right, cool. All right, cool. So what I'll do, I just want to play a little 10-minute clip from Joseph Bergeron addressing the mass hallucination hypothesis, because he is a clinical psychologist and a proven medical expert. Then after that, I don't want to dominate the show, so we can move on to the next topic. But
I have a couple of questions in the side chat too that we can come to afterwards. So yeah, go ahead and play your clip.
All right. Yeah, this was a great show. Joseph Bergeron actually wrote a paper, a peer-reviewed paper with Dr. Gary Habermas, maybe like 6 years ago, 5 years, I don't know. It was sometime in the 2010s, but yeah, it was a great paper refuting the hallucinations and stuff like that. So yeah, so this is about 10, 11 minutes. So
hallucinating. Well, you know, if you're going to
And you guys are hearing that, just to confirm?
Yes.
say that, if you're going to offer a medical explanation for what the disciples were experiencing, you need to provide a medical opinion and substantiation about how that would occur. Because a hallucination is a symptom, it's not really a diagnosis. You just don't say they were hallucinating and shrug and walk away and think you've done well, because you haven't. And so hallucinations occur primarily by three underlying mechanisms: psychophysiological, which could occur from perhaps certain types of strokes or tumors, or things that could cause hallucinations. Psychodynamic would be psychiatric disease and an intrusion into the conscious mind, which is people with severe mental illness can hallucinate, or psychobiochemical, where you have derangement of the brain chemistry, where people go into a state of delirium. And so you see that with alcoholic withdrawal, what's called the DTs. But you know, I have seen people in all those in all those conditions, and it's a very ugly thing to witness. I was talking to a physician one time, and he said, "You know, we see things that humans shouldn't have to see," and that's true. I mean, I think probably most of us in the medical work carry a certain level of PTSD. I've seen things that I don't like to think about, and to see someone in a chemical delirium is really ugly. I mean, they see snakes crawling in the bed. They see elephants walking in the room. It's scary. They're not having lunch with their beloved savior. And so when I collected all that literature and read through all of it, and just understood that they had no idea what they were talking about. And I was even reading the book, a book by one of the main proponents, the skeptic scholar named Gerd Ludemann. And I threw the book on the floor and I said, "You believe that?" I was talking to the book. Forgive me. I don't know. I had my own psychiatric moment. But I was talking to the book. I said, "How can you believe that?" You know, that it's just clear that they had no idea what they were talking about. And so, you know, were all the disciples suffering severe physical, psychiatric, or mental illness to the state that they were all hallucinating at the same time? Well, that's really not supportable. We're dealing with a group of people that Jesus hand-selected, trained, and who deployed the rapid expansion of Christianity in the first century. That I read Tacitus. By the time of AD 64, when Nero launched his first mass persecution of Christians, they were all over the place. So there was a rapid expansion of Christianity in the first century. So these people were really capable and dedicated. The other thing is that we talk about group appearances with Jesus. You mentioned, or Dan mentioned, when Jesus appears to the disciples and Thomas. So, you know, they're all seeing Jesus. There's a dozen of them or 11 of them, and they see Jesus. And in 1 Corinthians 15, the first creed of the church, Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. And when they recited the creed in those days, they would say, and most of them are still living.
Right.
So you can go talk to them. Well, we can't say that creed today, but we can understand the historical significance of it. And we read the work from Tacitus. Those people, you know, even people that didn't see him, it was so real to them, their faith in Christ, that they would die. They would accept being burned on the stake or crucified or whatever manner of torture, rather than to say it didn't happen. So the group experiences with Jesus there is no psychiatric explanation for that. So that's just outside the bounds of any kind of psychiatric phenomena. Now, there are times where groups of people can experience what you would call hallucinatory sorts of phenomena. But that those kind of things are rare, and they occur in a sense where there is a group sense of excitement and expectation. And they're never identical from person to person. Well, because they couldn't be, because any kind of hallucinatory occurrence is in the only and exclusively in the milieu of the person's brain. Again, when we're talking about hallucination, I should give a definition. It's an experience that is considered real by the conscious mind, for which there is no external stimulus of any of the five senses. So the hallucination, is real, but there's no physical basis for it. It's in the milieu of the person's brain. So in groups of people that experience that, it's never the same from individual to individual. With the disciples, that group dynamic was not present. They were in hiding and the door was locked, and Jesus walked through the wall. They thought they were next, right? So they were forlorn, they were in hiding. They did not go to the grave on Easter Sunday morning. The women went there to complete the embalming process, but nobody else went. There was no Easter sunrise service that day. So,
what? Oh, sorry. Is it okay if I just kind of ask you a question that's related to what you're saying here? So,
yeah.
So, granted, with group collective hallucinations, they don't happen in the sense that no one's having identical hallucinations, kind of thing. But they can have similar hallucinations through, like, explaining to people, like, oh, I saw Jesus or something. Could some kind of social contagion like that, if somebody said, I saw Jesus or something, could that create the expectation where they would have similar enough hallucinations? Or what's your take on something like that?
I don't know. That kind of ventures into a speculative sort of discussion. I think similarity does not equate to sameness.
Yeah. Fair enough. All right, cool. So continue on. I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to get your take on something like that.
No, carry on. I'm not sure if I think I was kind of done with that.
Okay, so I think you kind of get the point about there are many issues with positing group hallucinations of any sort and that sort of thing. And I'll just say, like, when in terms of my own argument with that social contagion thing, where I'm using that issue, the social dynamics, against the skeptic here, this isn't just my opinion or something that I made up the argument, I guess, but I've confirmed this with probably one of the most world's experts in hallucinations, Dr. Andre Aleximan and Frank Leroy. They wrote a book together on hallucinations. These are not Christians; they're secular experts. I learned about them through Gary and Mike Lacona, and I reached out to Aleximan myself back in the day years ago, and I can get the email exchange if he would allow it, but. I confirm that this is, in fact, the medical facts on the ground, that individuals that hallucinate would instantly lose their belief based on the social pressures. It wouldn't be, oh, I'm going to overcome and convince all of you guys. That's just not the way it works if hallucination is the expectation. So it would have to be, at the very least, the majority of them had these appearances, however you want to explain that, the real risen Jesus, or they all hallucinated somehow, then they're putting that pressure on the minority of the group. And as Josh said, yeah, they have to have that social respect over the minority to force them to change and say, yeah, I'm on board with this. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say, I guess. Anything else? Or you said you had questions, or?
We have a couple questions in the side chat, but they're about a different topic. So we're pretty much if you're wrapping up, we can move on to the audience questions for now. But yeah, as somebody who's kind of a psychology nerd, I hear exactly what he's saying. It's like there's not this magic shared environment of minds in which we can all share a delusion, right? Like you can share a common experience because we share a common medium in real life. but the mind just doesn't work like that. So yeah, I'm tracking with what he said. I agree.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cool.
So right on. Well, we actually have a question from somebody who I've been talking with for a long time and discipling for quite a few years. His name's Michael, and he's asking, let's say, a more practical ground floor question, which I really like. He said, "For us to live as God's children, do you believe it is by the transformation of the Holy Spirit through the working of the Holy Spirit, through testing and temptations that we go through? Is this a way that we die to ourselves and live to the Spirit? And is this a way that Jesus teaches those around us that he is alive?" Which is relevant to your resurrection talk just now, but in a really cool, different way. In the most direct sense, Michael, yeah, if we live as God's children, it is because the Spirit is in us. That's what it means to be God's children in this Romans 8 sort of way. We'll live and walk by the Spirit because we have the Spirit, and we're not walking by the flesh. We're walking as sons of God because the Spirit. That Spirit is, let's say, slowly or sometimes radically, all at once, changing things about you all the time. Sometimes it's through tests or temptations. Sometimes it's through good experiences. Sometimes it's because, something went really right and God just blessed you and it like stands out. Especially like, let's say that usually happens in a context where like you're having a really bad time, you're having a really hard time, and then God just does something and comes through for you, and it makes itself ridiculously obvious, like it's God's fingerprints right in your face. That can be transformative too. And you'll look at it and be like, whoa, okay, this is like, I can't ignore it anymore. Some people have experiences like that, but sometimes it's because you have a temptation and the Spirit is teaching you how to overcome that, sometimes through mere repetition. Like it's the same temptation over and over. Like I know Michael knows what I'm talking about. Sometimes it's the same temptation over and over. Sometimes it's a different temptation every day, and Satan's just dropping bombs in your lap moment to moment. And the Spirit is going to guide you, principally guide you through those experiences and give you a way out. 1 Corinthians 10, I believe it's 1 Corinthians 10, 13 says that all of our temptations are common to man, and that nothing that you're experiencing is just you, right? These are all things that we're all going to have to face individually, but the verse says something very specific. It says the Spirit is always creating for you a way out of the temptation so that you don't have to fall. You don't have to fall. You don't have to sin. You don't have to forget about where you're going and then just blow it, right? That does happen. No, none of us are going to lie and pretend like we're all just sinless professionals here. But at the same time, there are things where you have those moments of victory. You do. And you're like, I'm done with this thing. That no longer phases me anymore. Right? Like I used to have a problem when I was young, when I had girlfriends, at having my eyes be willing to stray and look elsewhere, let's say. I have a wife now, and you would think it's so much more difficult having lived with the same person for, let's say I've been with her for 14 years. Wouldn't my eyes grow accustomed to her and start seeking elsewhere? And the answer is no. I'm kind of over that temptation now. I love my wife, and I don't really have any like heightened inclination to want to like gander at other women. That's not a problem for me anymore. I've kind of overcome that temptation. Sometimes Satan tries to throw the same bait at me, but it really just doesn't work anymore. And because he's not a fool, he's not going to use bait that doesn't work. And so, like that's not the temptation that Satan will throw at me daily. The temptation that Satan throws at me daily is more like more like questioning my own motives because I feel like I'm not being charitable enough to somebody. I'm not able to do something, and so I lose my attitude, and I'm tempted into rage and a bad temper, and then it makes me a bad testimony before other people. Which, to the last part of your question, Michael, is this a way that Jesus teaches those around us that he's alive? As long as you're willing to speak up and say that's why you're different, and you point right back to Jesus, that's how people know that he's alive, at least in you. Especially people, and this is something that I think a lot of us don't recognize as much as we could. And I'll let you go after this, Dale, if you
Yep.
want to answer to this too. But if if you have people who knew you, let's say BC, before Christ, that period of your life, if you have people who knew you BC, then you are going to be it's gonna stand out more to them, the radical changes that are happening in your person, especially if they haven't seen you in a long time, and their expectation is, oh, that's good old so and so, they're like this. I'll hit them up and I have this expectation, this is what they're like. Then they meet you again and it's like meeting a different person, and then you're able to tell them. That's why our testimonies are so powerful, right? Like we have this ability to tell them, hey, I didn't just come out of this self-help group. I didn't wake up one day and be like, by golly, I'm gonna be good. Like I'm starting to overcome all these shortcomings that I have, because I have the guidance now, the power that's been given to me through this living Christ and his spirit and all these things. And you can, you don't always have to, say it that way, but ultimately I think it's both them seeing how we live and how we were versus how we are now, as well as our willingness to say out loud, yes, the credit is where credit's due. God is doing this work in and to me, and my cooperation in it is bringing about something that I couldn't have done by myself. I'm becoming a new thing. You know what I mean? So I think, and he said, sorry for the off-topic questions. These are not off-topic questions, bud. You're fine. It's an open mic.
Everything's
Yeah,
on.
anybody can ask any question they want. These are perfectly acceptable questions. And then, the second one is actually the
Okay.
second half of that over again. So I guess it was just the one series of questions. But yeah, if you wanna take a stab at it, Dale.
Yeah, so obviously, I definitely agree. Yes, in the first place, as God's children, do you believe it is by the transformation of the Holy Spirit? Yes, absolutely. I mean, apart from the Holy Spirit, that's who testifies to us as to the truth. It's who prompts us and helps and guides us to live a sanctified life, and increasingly more and more sanctified life and stuff like that. So, I mean, yeah, that's just kind of New Testament 101. I would definitely agree with that front. Interestingly, so, and then you say, and what about the working of the Holy Spirit through testing and temptations? And, Josh gave his own example. And again, on this front, I definitely wholeheartedly agree. I mean, Paul tells us in the New Testament that his suffering was suffering for Christians helps us to sanctify and reform our characters. It refines us and that sort of thing. And I think in Romans it also says, look, God uses everything that happens for the good for those that love Him. Now, some people are tested and tempted in different ways than others, so it's not saying like, oh, well, one size fits all. I've never been tested in the sense of being whipped like Paul has or something like that, but I've faced temptations and tests of different kinds that were appropriate for me. And, God promises us as Christians that we will never be tempted beyond our means as individuals to resist that sin and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think I'm fully in line with what Josh was saying and that sort of thing. And one thing I would say is okay, well, the fact that we go through tests and temptations is this proof of the working of the Holy Spirit? And I would say yes. So interestingly, believe it or not, because of the way our society is kind of treating Christians and stuff like that these days, I can kind of see a resurgence of some level of persecution coming back. My brother, who's not a believer, has noticed this, and this has really attracted him to Christians, the way they deal with that kind of growing persecution that we're facing. Again, we're not being lit up like candles in the Roman Empire, but we are facing persecution. He's noticed that difference with how Christians are, and that has attracted him to Christianity. So he's actually looking a lot more seriously into it, which has gotten me very happy and stuff like that. So
That's awesome, man.
Yeah. And there was one other question he asked. I can't remember.
It was, does Jesus use the appearance within our lives, like the appearance of our lives, to show others around us that he's alive and active?
Okay. Yeah. There was something else in the first comment.
Oh, here.
Because that's, is this a way that we die to ourselves and live to the Spirit? And is this a way? So yes, this is through being tested in temptation. This is definitely a way. Perhaps not the only way, but it is a way, definitely, that we die to ourselves. Look, we accept. Sometimes we go in knowingly that, oh shoot, I'm gonna bite the bullet on this one. I'm gonna suffer a little bit for standing up for Christ and stuff. But look, we die to ourselves. I'm not gonna regard that kind of temporary pain or whatever it is. I'm gonna do what I know is right for Jesus because I'm a part of him and I want to advance the cause of Christ. So absolutely. Yeah. The answer is yes to everything here.
Right
first
on.
last, did you have anything or?
No, I'm okay for now.
Okay. Out of curiosity, since you are here, is there anything that you wanted to talk about, just so we're not, making you stay here and stuff like that for nothing, but is there anything topics that were important to you?
Yeah, sure. Can you explain the Trinity?
Yes.
That's a fun one.
All right.
Oh man, I wish
And just
Dane
out of
was here.
what's your perspective in a nutshell, if you don't mind me? Are you like a Unitarian or first class?
Well, no, I feel that the God is a spirit, and that same spirit was born in flesh. So, God, I
Okay.
mean, during the time when Christ was on earth, you got the
Like incarnated?
God in heaven, and that same spirit was born on earth. So that the Holy Spirit or the Spirit of God would be the common denominator between the two.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah. So my take on the Trinity, and I know I have some differences with Josh on this front, but not major things. But so for example, from a biblical perspective, I think that the Bible deals with the question of who God is, the Godhead. And on that front, I take Richard Bauckham's perspective on the divine identity thesis, which kind of says in the Old and specifically in the New Testament, even more so explicitly, it teaches that there are three divine persons. So God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit that share the same divine identity. Now, what is the divine identity? So, only God, only someone with a divine nature is the creator and sustainer of everything else that exists. Only someone who has a divine nature is someone who is sovereign over the entirety, everything else that exists, and that sort of thing. So there are certain features that every first century Jew would have recognized. Who's Yahweh? That's Yahweh. He's the creator. He's the sustainer of the universe. He alone is the ruler of everything that exists. And there was also the cultic monotheism that Bauckham mentioned. So they would also say, well, who is God? He is the God of Israel. And they would point to the things that God has done specifically or that only God can do. So, for example, only God can save us from our sins, right? And okay, well, the New Testament is saying, well, Jesus saves us from our sins. So he also shares in that divine identifying feature, so to speak. Now, when we get to the second century, this is where I think philosophy comes in, and we're asking the question, well, what is the Godhead? And on this front, I take a social Trinitarian model called the Trinity monotheism that Dr. William Lane Craig takes, right? So there are three people that have three divine persons that have the divine identity, but there's one soul, one being or essence that I think is a soul, one soul with three sets of faculties sufficient for personhood. And that answers the question, what God is, such in a nutshell. So yeah, that's my take. Hopefully that was helpful. But Josh, what's your take?
I mean, since I don't want to rehash most of the, like, let's say the historical backdrop for that, I would say that my understanding of the Trinity is something that is, let's say, less, I don't know, less interpretation based and more like this makes sense of reality in a kind of relational way. um there's something that we've been talking about on my segment Cosmic Corner, which, by the way, 2 Fridays from now is our next episode if anybody wants to catch that. What one of the things that we've been talking about since last August, has been a common theme in most of our conversations, has been the problem of the one and the many, right? Life and reality is made up of multiplicities and unities. And it would make loads of sense for the God who created reality to reflect the resolve of that pattern and problem, because there's not much in reality that makes sense of the unities that we perceive, because we perceive things as unities. But if you were to take them and analyze them, you can break them down to smaller and smaller components all the way to the bottom and create just this atomized sea of everything, right? Where nothing quite has a unity. Some people make a joke of it and say, my atoms are made are my atoms here and my atoms here. I smash them together and they don't simply blast into oblivion. I have this continuity. I'm unified as a thing. But then you have the, oh, what is it? The ship of something or other. It's an old Greek problem where if you keep replacing the pieces of a ship over and over repeatedly, all of its individualized many pieces, that the unified ship, is it still the same ship? Does identity remain? And all of these things, it makes a really difficult question to ask. Why is reality this way if there's no resolve to that pattern or problem in the one who made reality? And if God is in fact the three in one that the church tradition has always said that he was, then it does have this great explanatory power, not just doctrinally, but reasonably out here in life as well, but also philosophically, because that's part of the question, is why is it this way? Why is it that way? And so you have, like, who is God? What is God? And then why is reality the way that it is? I feel like if you tied all three of those together, the Trinity has an exceptional explanatory power. So as far as like what the Trinity is or how to explain it, I'd have to get like a more particularized, like, it's such a vague, like, it's a really big topic to try to kind of narrow down and say, what is it? Why is it? Like, but as far as why, Theseus, thank you, BJ. It was the ship of Theseus is the identity problem I was talking about. But as for what the Trinity is, in its simplest thing, it's the whole of God understood by the parts of God. And what I mean by parts are not like, like individualized pieces that you could break apart from one another. Like Dale said, they share an essence, they share a unified being. They are one whole, right? But they're not separate from one another, but they're distinct from one another. And we see this distinction of personhood laid out pretty well in scripture, but explicitly in the early church. And so this is not, it's not something that is easily explained, because God is obviously holy and divinely unlike anything that he's created. And yet we see shadows of his reality in creation. Romans 1 says that he's made himself evident sufficiently to us to understand and know his divine attributes. And if I'm to take the one and the many problem seriously, which seems to be a problem that affects literally everything that exists, then it would make sense to me that God also is a one and many with that resolve for that pattern, if that makes sense.
Was that helpful?
Yeah, parts of that was pretty good. Just ask one more other question. What do
Okay.
you think it means, the capital W word? What do you think that's referring to?
Capital W word?
Can you give me an example? What do you mean?
Well, the word in John, let's say John in
Oh, like the
Gospel of John.
logos.
Oh, okay. My bad. Okay. Oh, you're talking about in scripture when the word word is capitalized.
Right.
Okay, usually that's in reference to what we call the logos, which is, if you can think about it, it would be a personified version of the understanding of God. If that it's hard to kind of explain. I don't want to like oversimplify logos, but the word, like let's say John 1 is probably what you have in mind, I'm sure. John chapter 1 makes explicit that the word being referenced is Christ, and that it was with God and that it was God. And so it participates in the identity of God, right? But is in itself something distinct from God proper, let's say. This is where other models of the Trinity might be helpful. There's the monarchical model where you have God the Father is God proper, and the Spirit and the Son are proceeding forth from him eternally. They're not created. They're let's say it's the byproduct of God's being and identity that the other two persons would proceed from him. Something like that. I'm oversimplifying this terribly because I'm not a Trinitarian scholar, but I've had a lot of interplay with this. But if it's helpful at all to you, on Tuesday nights at 7, we actually have a Trinitarian apologetics show hosted by Dane Von Ace, where he talks about a lot of this stuff, and he does a pretty bang up job, explaining these things in a really long form.
What was that? Yeah, that sounds good. But what was that? That last model you said it was a Trinitarian monarchical.
It's the monarchical Trinitarian. It basically it's the you can think of it as the monarchy of the Father. That's the Eastern Orthodox view of the Trinity, as opposed to the Western Catholic or Protestant view of the Trinity as a let's say an equilibrium of persons. In the East, they would see the Father as ultimately supreme, but the other two are not less God than the Father. They proceed eternally from the Father. And so that's why I would say, when you're thinking about it that way, the Father is God proper, and Jesus is the Son of God, and the Holy Spirit is the Spirit of God, God proper being the Father, which is why you would have reconciliatory statements of Jesus being God, but also Jesus saying, I do nothing of myself, only what I see the Father do. Things like that. It's a kind of a reconciling of those things. And so if that's helpful, but our show on the Trinity on Tuesday nights is called Three Crowns, for anybody in the audience who wants to know also. Dane does a really great job articulating some of this stuff. Really well, but
just a few things to add on my end about this question and stuff like that. So first of all, believe it or not, the notion that the Son is begotten and the Holy Spirit proceeded, that isn't just Eastern Orthodox. There are Western people that believe that as well, right? Models of that. But one thing, okay, so the word, so I take kind of the same views as Josh. It is Jesus, it's the divine logos and that sort of thing. But I think in the Gospel of John, just something unique to add here is I take it being akin it's not using Platonic Greek philosophy or something, referring to some kind of rational principle. It's talking about the memra in the Aramaic Targums. There's this notion of the memra of the Lord, which is Aramaic for word and that sort of thing. And they add this notion that words are kind of tangible entities, right? And how does God create the world? He spoke the world into existence, right? So Jesus is the word kind of thing, in that he created the universe. And that's why the New Testament says God the Father created the universe. How did he do it? By speaking it. And the spoken word created stuff as the active agent. So he created it through Jesus. So that's one difference there. Last thing, we do have a question from Brian in the audience related to this Trinity aspect. So with my model, he asks, was the soul of Jesus fully human and fully divine, so in incarnate form, while he was on earth? Was that the same soul that Dale says the triune God has? So remember, under the Trinity monotheism model, there's one being or one soul that has three sets of faculties sufficient for personhood. So only the person of Jesus, God the Son, became incarnate. So it's not like the entire soul became embodied. It was only the part of the faculties, the person, that became embodied. And I do have some differences with the Orthodox. I don't think that they're, for example, there's been some people throughout history have said, oh, well, there was two persons, the divine person. No, there's one person. What does it mean to have a human nature? You are one person that becomes embodied in a physical body governed by the human genome. And in this, so there was no extra human soul. That doesn't make sense to me. That I don't believe in that. I would also deny that Jesus had like a human will. No, he just had his one person, one mind, one will, and he gained a body governed by the human genome. So yeah, there is only ever one soul, and only part of that soul, 1/3 of the soul, became incarnate. So yeah.
I think also it'd be helpful to distinguish between soul in the way that you're talking about it, which is something more like the essence or being of a person, from the idea of nephesh from Genesis, when God breathed life into the body of Adam, the first human, and he became nephesh, a living soul, right? Jesus became nephesh also when he was embodied in the human platform, like you said. But there's also his godness remained intact. Hey, what's up, BJ? It remained intact while he was embodied, right? And so in that sense, there's this, they call it the hypostasis, like it's the combination, the this unity of the two coming together. That's why the incarnation is one of the craziest mysteries that you'll probably never get to the bottom of ultimately. But I think to back up Dale's point, it wasn't the entirety of God and his being embodied in the human platform. It was the Son of God that proceeds eternally from the Father, who was embodied in the human platform. And so being spirit and flesh is the kind of nephesh that Jesus had, that soul he had. And that was that was part of God, surely, but it's not the same thing as all of God coming down and fitting inside of. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I'm
before I go to BJ, just very quickly to answer Sean Schultz's question, because this is again aimed at me. But okay, so doesn't Jesus need two wills if will is a property of a nature? And that's where my disagreement is. No, a will is a property of a person, not a nature. Because when we talk about Jesus having two natures, well, what is a nature? It's a kind nature. All the essential sets of properties that are essential for that kind of thing to be what it is. Sets of properties don't have wills. Persons have wills. Sets of properties don't have minds. A person has a mind. So I would say that the will is a property of the mind. That's just the difference that I have with the Orthodox. But yeah, BJ, over to you. Do you have a question or something to contribute based on anything, or you're just here?
Can y'all hear me? Is my mic good?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, good. Okay. I had a question completely different from the Trinity, except it's about Christianity.
Yeah,
cool.
Oh, okay. So I put it on a Facebook group that got a lot of traffic. The question came up while we were just. Well, first I'll ask the question and then I'll see what y'all say. Okay. So here's the question. It's really weird. Okay. All right.
No, Josh is weird. So, well, David Russell's weird. I got to stay
consistent.
he's the punching bag.
All right. I got some flack for asking this question, but I was like, oh, calm down. Okay. All right. If you, I don't recall how I worded it. I would have it pulled up on Facebook or something, but my phone and my computer are going really slow. Okay. If you can, sorry. Okay. If you could guarantee someone's salvation by committing a sin, would you sin? Or maybe if you could commit sin and it guarantees someone's salvation, would you commit sin.
Are you?
Now I might interrupt y'all if like y'all say stuff and I've got stuff in my mind, but I'll try to listen because I've already interacted with a bunch of people about it. So yeah, go for it.
No worries. Yeah, so I'll try to be as concise as possible. Okay, so it's just the fact that it's guaranteed to save a soul if I commit a sin.
Yeah.
So I think my answer, all things considered, would be yes, because for human beings, there are times when we experience a moral conflict between two or more moral principles in the moral hierarchy. So, for example, I would lie and tell someone that the sky's red if it would save a life. I would also lie if it would save their soul. That's even more a weighty consideration. So I think there are times where we have to choose. It's called conflicting gradism. It's the lesser of two evils. So sometimes we're just in a position where we have to choose between two. Now, if you're telling me in your example, but there's a third option where you don't sin and you still guarantee that soul, obviously I would not sin. It's never morally ideal. It never comes without cost, but it looks like you disagree. So yeah, go ahead.
Only two options. You
Only
sin.
two.
Yes, I would sin if it would guarantee to save a soul, or no, I would not sin if it guaranteed to save the person. Other people said stuff like, I would lie, for X, Y, and Z reasons. Or somebody said like if I had to jaywalk, or if me buying a dress that I'm like lust of the eyes, ooh, that dress would look good on me. But if I go and buy it, then I could talk to the person and I would save their soul or whatever. If they knew that was a fact, then they would give in to their materialism or something. That doesn't seem like you're committing the materialism to save the soul. But I wouldn't see things like sinning, like lying, like Rahab or the Hebrew midwives.
Yeah.
I wouldn't see those as sins in the ultimate sense.
Yeah. So here's one thing I'll say, and I'll give it to Josh because I know he's trying to get in. But so I do not advocate for utilitarianism. It's not like the ends always justify the means. So sometimes it's never morally ideal, but sometimes it's morally permissible, given we're in a fallen world and we can do the lesser of two evils. But there are other sins where it's just a no-go. Like I would never rape someone just to guarantee a soul is saved, and or something. Or I would never treat people as a slave, because we have to remember God. He can't lie even if it guarantees the salvation of a soul, right? So that, and that's always because he's obviously got other options and stuff. He's of the divine nature and stuff like that. So it's not the same thing. But yeah, there are certain things where the ends just will never justify those means. So if you tell me to like I said, rape someone or torture an innocent baby just for the heck of it, and you're guaranteeing this soul will be saved. No, the answer is no matter what.
It sounds like, it really does sound like to me, we're saying if it's not that bad of a sin.
Yeah, I think you have to do that kind of cost benefit analysis and stuff like that. And
I do, and I think what Prudence just said in the chat here, the severity of the sin is an important factor. I think if that's the way that we're looking at the question, then it kind of, I think, cheapens your point a little bit. I think the question is, let's say, what if I define sin, because the way I define sin is not primarily as a moral infraction. The way I define sin is anything that deviates from God's divine intent for you and your purpose. Anything. It doesn't even have to be something that's explicitly immoral. It could just be not talking to that person over there in the blue sweater when you had the unction to go and talk to that person in the blue sweater, and they go home and they have a depressive fit and hurt themselves. And it's because you didn't go and stand up and talk to them. You didn't do anything forwardly evil to them. It was negligence, right? And so that also is sin, right? And so in that generalized sense, anything that deviates from God's intent for you is sin, right? If I were to take like the worst version of that, right, which I think would be something like killing myself or someone else, I think this is actually something that's vaguely comparable to Paul's opening of Romans 9, that he said, I would gladly be damned personally if that would bring about the salvation of my kinsmen. And those were people who disdained him, right? And so like if we can kind of take that lead, let's say, and say, taking on the moral guilt, the infraction, the whatever, that if that's going to be something that brings about the good of an eternal soul coming to God, then there's something about that has to be, it has to be something where it's not like, oh, well, I wouldn't do something so bad, right? Like I feel like Paul, if he's willing to, and I might be muddying the water a little bit by thinking about it this way. So correct me if I'm misunderstanding you.
Other people said gave the same example of Paul, what you're saying, and I actually have a reply to that too.
Okay.
But finish your thing and then I'll reply.
I was saying that if it came to the question of whether or not I would have to accrue some sort of moral guilt for myself in order to ensure that somebody else would be saved, that moral guilt and the framework that I have for why that would be a negative in any sense is the situation of salvation and an infraction against God, right? And I think that that's directly comparable in some real sense to the way Paul says, I would gladly take on damnation for myself in order to save my kinsmen. Unless that isn't what you're asking necessarily. But for me, that's probably the most intuitive thing that I would go to, the way that I define sin as a deviation from God's intent rather than specifically a moral infraction. Deviation from God's intent is to fall short of the glory, to not image God properly. And as Sean said, more of a jest than anything, I sin for much less noble reasons.
I tend to think of sin as anything, like you say, anything, right? Anything that hurts God, goes against God. I'm not a Calvinist, so I think God, he can be hurt. But anything that goes against God, to try and keep it as simple as possible. The Paul example, you kind of said something on the back end, which kind of made me think you were getting at something else. But the Paul example, other people said he would be a curser, for his friends. And I said, I don't think that Paul meant, by his logic of saying that, I don't think that he meant he would be accursed by committing a sin or because he committed sin against God, but just that he would, like, I guess, like Jesus took our punishment, like he would take the punishment. And if somebody were to say, well, Paul, the only way you can be accursed, you a human, would be to commit sin, he would say something like, wait, you're taking my logic and a little too far. I think he would that's just my opinion. There's other times in it Paul says, should we do evil that good may come? No, anathema on that kind of thinking. He says that in Romans. Other people, yeah, they would mention like I would do this. You said something about bringing guilt on yourself, but then you switched really quick. Other people did seem to say, when I was discussing this on Facebook, other people seem to say, well, I would do anything to save that person. I would do anything to save myself. Of course I would do anything. I love that person. I care for those people. I would take guilt on myself in order to save someone else. Love your neighbor as yourself. This might sound bad to many people. And I was with my wife. She's a youth pastor and I was a helper. And I said sometimes like, hey, God might want you to choose him over your family. No, he would never want to do that or whatever, But I don't think, it's like who's more important, God, family, church, friends, other people. I don't think God's on a list like that, But if you had to see something as more important, it would be like God. So if I had to do something, hurt God to love my neighbor by saving him, I just couldn't see how I could hurt God. I just couldn't see how I could do that.
Could I ask you a question?
Yeah, go for it. I want to talk about this because it's bothering me that people would actually answer yes to it, and then I'm like, no, wait, maybe I should discuss it to see what they say.
Yeah, because I used to have the exact same opinion as you. I used to take the unqualified absolutist approach, like Immanuel Kant. Nope, I would never, you're never going to get me to lie. I'm not going to sin no matter what. Like I'm going to stay ideal and pure. And it's true. Whenever we choose the lesser of two evils, even under my new view, where I say that there are times where we have to choose it, it does corrupt us. Sin always corrupts us, takes us away from our design goal. So it's never a cost to bear lightly, because it always has an impact. But
Right.
what I wanted to ask you, BJ, the reason I kind of changed my mind is that I realized there are things like sins of omission. And I wanted to ask, first of all, do you recognize that there could be sins of omission? And if so, it could be that, sure, if you sin and tell a lie to save life, you're hurting God by lying. But if you don't, you're hurting God even more by causing or indirectly causing that life to be dead. Yeah.
The graded, the way I heard, I think it's a Geisler called it graded absolutism, and I don't know many. Huh?
Oh no, sorry. I take the conflicting approach, which means there are times where we do the lesser of two evils kind of thing. Yeah.
I think that if there's a lesser of two evils, and so this is all very abstract and hypothetical. People kept saying, "Well, you have to give me a real scenario," and I'm like, if I give a real scenario, we'll focus on the scenario rather than the idea or the concept. That's what I'm getting at. So this is all hypothetical. So to me, if you had two evils and one was lesser, then essentially that would not be evil.
No. So it's going to remain.
I know.
Sin is sin, right? So here's an example that contrasts, right?
If
so
God put us in that situation, then what is it? You always have a way of escape. Well, then, I mean, so I don't think we could be in that situation anyway. I'm sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, I guess I just kind of, I don't believe you. I think there are times in this fallen world, respectfully, but yeah, this fallen world, there are times when we can't escape. We literally have two options, both of which are to sin. Now, there are times, I wouldn't say, oh, well, it's morally good or ideal to sin. No, sin is always sin. We are doing something wrong regardless, but it's just, we have no choice. So let's do the least wrong thing that we can, because we always look for and never want to do anything wrong. We should be always trying to find that third solution. But sometimes if we find ourselves and there's only two, then okay, let's do at least the least bad thing. Now, there are times that, last thing I want to add is, there are certain things that may seem like they're not morally ideal. So for example, killing. There's I believe in deontology and teleology. So I would take moral rules and principles. There's a principle of life preservation. But we kill sometimes in war out of self-defense or because it's a justified war. I think that what the soldiers were doing was good there. So that wasn't the lesser of two evils. We actually exempted the moral principle in that case. And what we did was good. I celebrate my grandfather. And the proof of that is that, look, God kills too. So obviously it's not a sin to exempt a moral principle. But unfortunately, in a fallen world, there are times when we can't exempt a moral principle, and we have to just violate one. And yeah.
There's a guy that came after John Wesley, who was kind of the theologian who tried babies versus giants. Okay, sorry.
That's an inside joke. I don't know.
It is an inside joke.
I listen to the Lord of Spirits podcast, and they talk about giants all the time. But that's not what we were talking about. Okay, anyway, there was the theologian philosopher guy right after John Wesley, who many people thought would carry the Wesleyan movement, but then he ended up, much like, you got Pelagian, and then you got people who after him took it way too far, or Calvin, you got people who took it way too far. Mm-hmm. Kind of the same thing. And he said something like, the only absolute is love. So if we do a loving thing, then we should do that. And he gave some scenario. I wish I remember the theologian's name. He gave a scenario about something about if you had to commit adultery in order to you were in prison and you had information, you commit adultery on your wife, you know, in order to obtain a better good for the love of a bunch of people, then he would do it. Not murder, but the main exemption that people seem to say were, well, I might do this sin, I might do that sin. Oh, but I wouldn't commit adultery. People would say, well, murder sometimes isn't murder. Sometimes it's killing, like in war, it could be, you know. But I don't think anybody would say, well, I would commit adultery. Or you said rape, you know. So just to say that there's one theologian that was like, yeah, go for it. Everybody else is saying, no, that's the cutoff line.
I think the consequences in that case is so significant because we are denying the intrinsic value of human beings when we do that, and we're creating immense spiritual damage. Like why is premarital sex wrong or homosexuality a sin and all this stuff? It causes spiritual damage.
So what if the spiritual damage? Yeah.
So in that case, the cost is. Oh, sorry.
I said that's in Philippians. I think Paul talks about even if if it's a prostitute, something weird happens and they have sex. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, exactly. So in that case, the damage overall it's too great to justify it, even for whatever the good is in that case. So I can never see a situation in which committing adultery or rape or premarital sex with a prostitute, whatever it is, I would never justify that. Just like with slavery, where the true slavery is denying, the 1800s version, where we deny the humanity of it. Or for another example that would be relevant today is lying, right? I said I am willing to lie in certain cases, but what if a transgender says, well, lie to me, tell me my pronouns or I'm going to kill myself? In that case, the implications are too great, where I would say, no, I'm not going to lie. I'm going to use your proper pronouns, even if you kill yourself, because the consequences beyond just even that person is even more, right? It causes immense damage to me, to God. It also causes immense damage to society, where we're kind of being blackmailed and held captive to these activists who keep pushing it more and more and further. It seems like, given the circumstances, the right thing to do is, no, it's the line in the stand. You're a man or you're a woman, whatever you were born as. And it's not worth it to lie to even save your life in that case.
But there's also the question of because you were talking specifically, BJ, you had defined sin as something that is bringing a hurt or a sadness to God, not in like a defying immutability sort of way, but the way that Scripture uses it, where God had repented of and was grieved of making man in the flood and so forth. That God expresses Himself that way. If we were to ask the question, just to kind of play with a thought experiment further, which would be a further hurt on God, to see one of His imagers destroyed in damnation, or to see me commit some particular sin, individualized sin? If you flip the question backward, I think you get perhaps a different perspective of the answer that's granted. If you withheld a sin and you damned someone by doing so,
I think God would be happy that we didn't sin. I don't think that sinning avoiding the sin to send somebody to hell essentially would be a sin.
So then,
because you're right, you can flip the logic backwards, kind of like we say, hey, if there are, since I'm always in the Calvinism thing, they're elect people, and we say, then there are unelect people that God sent. Then no, it doesn't work backwards, and we're like, but it does, bro. Right. Well, so I can see the same thing working backwards, but I guess like Dell said, I just don't agree, or whatever. I guess maybe I'll change my mind someday.
One interesting thing that may, again, I can see how you might interpret it differently, but isn't there a verse, and I forget where it is, if it was Paul or Moses or something? I think it was Paul.
Those are two very different people. At very different time. I'm sorry.
I agree. But he says something to the effect of that, if it were possible, I would damn myself if it could save more souls. But
That was
ultimately,
Paul.
that's the wrong thing to do, because it's so important that first of all, it's impossible to do, right? Because it takes a free will decision on each person's part and stuff. But that kind of mentality might suggest that there could be times where it's conflicting, even if that wasn't an example of it. There could
Moses.
be. Go ahead.
Moses said he was praying on the mountain, to God, and God was like, I'm going to destroy these people. And then he said the thing that he's not supposed to say. God said, "Oh, okay, I changed my mind." But Moses is praying, and he said, "Lord, blot my name out of the book of life." And then God's like, "Hey, I'm going to do what I want to do. You can't be telling me what to do, Moses, with this salvation thing. I'll blot out whoever. I'll have mercy on sacrifice, whatever. And then God does, quote unquote, repent or whatever. But then later, Paul in Romans 9, and then again in Romans 10, he says, I would wish myself accursed for my brothers. And I'm thinking, I don't think Moses said, "Hey, God, I'll commit a sin so you can blot my name out."
That's a fair
Maybe
point.
that was in his mind. I don't know.
That's a fair point. I feel like I think you're making a relevant distinction too, to say Paul was willing to take on the effects of the curse, but he didn't say, I'm willing to violate my relationship with God in order for this to happen. I feel like I'm gathering what you're saying now. I think perhaps when I said that initially, I might have misunderstood the intent of the question to be a question of whether or not something like that could be in any circumstance justifiable, rather than how would you deal with this scenario in a way that keeps, like, maintains the how would you even say it, maintains the normal working circumstance of how I'm supposed to be as somebody who is saved, who's following Christ, claiming the name and so forth. It's just, it's difficult. I'll grant it to you. This is a hard question. I've never gotten it before. So kudos for that. I
I'm a genius.
am not often stumped.
So
BJ's question was great, or was
yeah,
it
no, BJ's question is something that I have not been confronted with that way. And I feel,
like, see how smart I am. I asked the best question, and
no,
BJ.
I don't think.
Go ahead.
What came about was this. Okay, whenever I first asked this, several people were like, "Are you talking about aborting babies? Are you talking about Bailgate?" And I was like, "No, I'm not." And they're like, "But that would be a sin that would guarantee a baby salvation if infants and babies are automatically saved." I'm talking very generally. I'm not getting into the theology of all that. Okay, if babies are automatically saved, then aborting them would guarantee their salvation. Okay, so obviously you mean that sin, right? And I just said, I mean any sin. I'm not talking about that. But where this came up was somebody said, "Hey, what about the whole aborting babies and sinful thing?" And I was like, we shouldn't do that. Paul tells us not to do that in Romans 3, and then I think in Romans 6, should we sin so that glory may abound? He condemns that. And me and the guy were discussing, and at one point he said something about, well, it's, since you would, save a whole generation by aborting them, that you should admit that it's absurd reasoning. And I was like, wait, did he mean you as in like me, BJ, since I would do that? Wait, does he really think that I would like commit sin to save someone's soul? I was like, wait, how did that even come into someone's mind? I had, for some reason, even though if there's a crazy thought, then someone thunk it. There's nothing new under the sun. For some reason that hit me, like I never thought a Christian would have ever, and I told the guy, no, I wouldn't. He was like, wait, you wouldn't? I was like, of course not. Wait, I don't get it. I'm like flabbergasted. Well, anytime I get that way, I get like, no, period, end of discussion. That sits off a trigger in my mind. I go, wait, I should think this through more. So I made another Facebook poll asking about this, and so far, I still feel my convictions are correct, and things that y'all have said have helped me think it through it more.
Here's my take on that. It's a little bit different. It might help. I have the same answer as you, that I would say no, right? Because let's, for the example, for sake of argument, okay, great, we've got an entire generation of little babies or something like that, and we slaughter them as soon as they're born to hypothetically get them saved, right? The entire lot of humanity born in that generation is saved, and we keep doing this with each baby. Great. So you might save, I don't know, let's say, like, I have no idea how many babies are born in a year over history on average or something, but let's say we save 2 million souls get saved that way. But by letting them be born and having impacts on each other through time, maybe it's the case that 10 million souls would have been saved at the end of the day because other people would have freely chosen to put their faith in Christ. So living their lives has morally and salvifically relevant considerations and stuff like that. It's not an easy, we can't make that calculation, but God does. And God is telling us in Romans, like you said, let those babies live. Yes, there's a chance that they might be damned as a result, but I'm telling you, my end goal will only be achieved by them living. Don't just wipe out humanity and stick me with 2 million. I want the 10 million souls or something like that. That's my answer.
If I could adjust my answer slightly, I think that I'm gonna jump on the no bandwagon also, but for a different reason. I'm thinking about Pharaoh. I'm thinking about the way that God raised up Pharaoh. God raised up Pharaoh in order that God's might and power might be displayed. God allowed Israel to be enslaved for 400 years prior to rising up against Pharaoh. All of this seems in some sense like vaguely good grounds for me to justify doing something that was sinful in order that I might achieve some greater end. I think what that does is put me in a position that is not in fact mine. God was able to do that because of who he is. I am not able to do that because of who I am. I think that's the best answer, is God has jurisdiction to play God. I do not. And so I would hasten to like Dale said, not to be, like political or whatever, but the whole gender identity thing is something that lands close to home for me because I live in the Bay Area near San Francisco. I'm like 20 minutes from San Francisco. It's something that I actually encounter rather regularly, is this controversy. And as a really overtly prudish and religious person, it's very difficult to go out in the world and not see that and be like, and so when somebody, I had a, I'll go into it shortly, but I worked, before I worked at the Bay Area Rescue Mission, I worked at let's call it an assembly line process for a company called Echo Health. And they made amplifiers for stethoscopes with sound canceling technology so that you can hear better inside the ambulance or in the emergency room with crazy noises going on. You could hear the breathing and the heartbeat really clearly. So it's great technology, is good stuff. I really liked the company I was working with them. 2 or 3 of the people that I worked with were living actively homosexual lifestyles, and one of them was actually transgender. And they insisted that their pronouns be this or that. My response to that was not a yes or a no. It was in fact to bypass the issue by finding a third thing, because I wasn't going to like compromise my morals in order to comfort the situation, but I didn't want to be unduly uncharitable and cause controversy. And so I used a pronoun that would be suitable for anyone. It's called the name. So I asked their name and I called them by their name rather repetitively. It got annoying, but I was not going to use alternative pronouns and all that stuff. I wasn't going to play the game. So I played my own game. I became as annoying as possible by repeating their name almost every sentence. And it ended up being something where they stopped insisting that I play the game because of how much more annoying I was than the game. Right. And so in that sense,
you're heaping hot coals on their head.
Right, exactly. By not doing so, I'm making a larger impact than doing so, if that makes sense. I'm playing my role properly so God can play his role. And I feel like imagining the question, the way that you've laid it out, the way that I'm understanding it now, would be I need to grab at God's position in order to do this. That's how I feel like I would be trying to play God in that scenario by justifying something that otherwise would not have been justifiable.
I recall I asked my wife. We might want to move on from this question. I feel pretty good. I asked my wife the question, and me and her, we generally this was an accident. I don't think we're got together in the afterlife. And afterlife, the before life. We're not Mormons or whatever. Talked about this. Or, I don't know. I'm rambling. So I asked my wife about this, and she was like, "Well, no, of course." Or she didn't say no. She said, "Well, I'm not responsible for someone else's salvation, so no, I wouldn't do that." And she said more stuff and fleshed it out like we have.
That's really intuitive. She's very smart.
Well, thank you.
I feel like I'm the only one who hasn't been complimented for being smart.
Well, you're standing in front of Stonehenge. I mean, come on.
Okay,
I've never been to Stonehenge.
Oh man!
Yeah, did that? Out of curiosity, BJ, I get we may disagree on some stuff, but was it helpful at all? Were our answers?
It mostly helps in that I can understand where other people are coming from.
Okay.
So we could discuss it better in the future, or and besides just generally gaining wisdom, I find discussions like these helpful because the three of us have talked about it, and however much we agree or disagree, we've grown to know each other better. We've grown closer.
Mm-hmm.
So it builds one of the main. Okay, so here's another soapbox. Okay, this is kind of different. One of the main themes of the Bible, specifically the New Testament, I assume it's in the Old Testament. I should think about that. Jesus said he wants us to be unified. He wants us to be one as him and God are one. And I feel like these discussions that often will make us argue and divide, I feel it's opposite. I feel like if we play the fruits of the Spirit correctly, if we're kind, we're patient, we're loving, then we can have these discussions, disagree, and it actually draws us closer to each other.
I have a lived experience of that with our co-host Tyler. In fact, I have some living proof that if you care more about the person than your point, you will in fact grow closer, and you will in fact understand one another better, and likely you will in fact end up agreeing more often than not, simply because you're willing to give the regard to take each other seriously. That's something that I've been able to live out and play out with multiple people. But for a specific example, people that are familiar with the show, if you know Tyler Fowler at all, he's somebody who's very serious about what he believes. He's a real inquirer, and he's trying to figure things out, and he'll take something right to its end, and if he believes it, he really believes it, and so he's not somebody that you'll poke lightly and get away with it. And I've been able to be best friends with him for upwards of 6.5 years, and we've changed each other's minds on lots of things, and it's because of the fact that we've taken each other seriously, and we've, like you said, exercised fruits of the Spirit in conversation. And of course I've pissed him off, and he's done the same to me, but that always ends up being swallowed up in our concern for one another and our quickness not to make an enemy, right? But to really listen carefully to what the other person is saying enough that we learn to say I understand before we say I disagree.
Now, Josh, I don't mean to spoil this hippie moment, because I agree fully with you when it comes to Tyler. The problem is we have someone like David Russell, and that heretic is just too far. Everyone has to disagree with that guy, and there's no charity.
It's morally obligatory to tell David he's wrong.
He doesn't drink milk out of a bag. I mean, come on, it's
Oh, that's David. I thought that was you, David, the Canadian, the drinker. I mean, they're both
Canadians,
Dale and.
we do drink
Oh.
milk in a bag, and he always makes fun of me for it. So that's what I was saying. He
Oh,
doesn't, so he is the
he
outside.
doesn't. Yeah, no, where we drink wine out of bags. So I mean,
Oh, where are you from?
Texas.
Texas. Oh, in the U.S. Okay, all right.
Yeah, U.S. There are these cardboard boxes with like fancy pictures of wine, and
Yeah.
I'm like, if it comes out of a cardboard box, it can't be.
You know what? Yeah, they're probably drinking David Russell's wine because he makes his own wine. So
Yeah, I remember that from
He does. It's true. He does. Right on. Well,
Awesome.
you know what? We're approaching. We just passed the 2 hour mark, so I don't know
We can go to another.
how long you're ready to go, Dale. But I mean I'm pretty much ready to start winding down if you are.
Yeah, same here. I think we had a good mix of, I think 3 or 4 questions. So I was happy with it and stuff like that. I got out my response to Paulogia. So I hope for my fans of Real Seekers who are worried about Paulogia's response, there's nothing to be worried about it. There are so many critiques that one could make about it. So don't be worried about it. Neither me nor Gary are. Oh, take care, BJ. Yeah, the resurrection's true. And we have lots of great evidence for it, and that's included in Gary's new book. So yeah.
Right on. Well, do you have any plugs that you want to do for Real Seekers or anything coming up that you want to let everybody know about?
Yeah, so I'm supposed to be on my podcast vacation in February, but that's just turned. I had 1 week off, but that's a total lie. So tomorrow I'm going to be on the show with Phil Bear, discussing the topic of is water baptism necessary for salvation or not?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then the week after that, I've got a couple shows. So I've got a show with Dr. Thomas McAvoy on science and faith. So he knows about evidence from the Big Bang and creation versus evolution stuff, as well as a little bit on the Shroud of Turin. And then I have my famous panel thing on Saturday the 17th, specifically looking at those radiation hypotheses that I had planned before. So yeah, those are the news for Real Seekers.
Cool. Right on. As far as the Faith Unaltered end goes, next week, David is having on Ben Watkins to talk about the problem of evil again. David, again, is doing a development for his own project at school for in his schooling for the problem of evil, and is developing that right now. And so he's doing a lot of ongoing discussions with people about the problem of evil. So if that's something that you're interested in, check that out next week at Friday, 7 Eastern. The following Friday after that will be the next episode of the Cosmic Corner, in which I will have on perhaps a couple of new faces, but some of the same faces that other people have seen from Gambia. That's amazing. Hi, welcome. Thanks for hanging out with us. Glad we actually have a Twitter. That's pretty cool. Yeah. So the next episode for Cosmic Corner coming up in 2 Fridays from now is going to be a follow-up to our last episode about vampires and vampirism, spiritual vampirism, and what it means to be fed on or feed on something or someone. The next episode in our follow-up is going to not be about vampires, but about zombies, the other monster that feeds on you. Right. And so we're going to be expanding that conversation a little bit. Beyond that, I don't know that there's anything scheduled for the following Friday, but Tyler seems to have something lined up for the beginning of March that he's excited about. I don't recall him letting me know what it is yet, but be on the lookout for that. And again, every Tuesday afternoon / evening, we have 3 Crowns with Dane, our Trinitarian apologist. Great stuff, really great stuff. If you guys want to learn about the Trinity, if you have any questions, or if you're confused, or you're just like, I've heard the word, but I don't really know what it means. We talked about it rather briefly here tonight when we had First Last on. But if you guys want to dig deep on Trinitarian doctrines and learn how to do some Trinitarian apologetics, Dane is your guy. Dane is number 1. And as far as that goes, I think that's pretty much all we have on the roster for Faith Unaltered right now, other than tomorrow and Monday. Tomorrow and Monday are going to be special episodes that Tyler and I are running. We're talking about Calvinism. This is going to be relevant to the whole Ballgate thing. But we're kind of coming at it at a different angle. We're not going to do just another interview on the controversy of particularly infant damnation or anything like that. We're going to be talking about arguments against Calvinism and the best ones that we've encountered personally. So tomorrow we're going to have Dr. Leighton Flowers, as well as Jordan Hatfield from Great Light Studios, and then another new face who I haven't actually met yet or interacted with, but his name is Lucas. What is it? It's Lucas Curcio. I think that's how you pronounce it. He's going to be coming on as well to discuss Calvinism tomorrow, and then we're going to have a follow-up episode on Monday, and we're going to be talking about, again, just the best arguments that we've encountered against Calvinism, and so that's going to be a couple of special episodes. But as far as our regular Fridays and regular scheduled stuff, that's pretty much what we got going on. So that's pretty much it.
Awesome. Great show. Yeah, I enjoyed it. So
yeah,
good
this
job
was a
to
good
you.
conversation. I actually have to say, I'm kind of happy that this was our first interaction where you and I were like hosting together. This was really cool, and I feel like I don't feel like we did a bad job. You know what I mean? Like, I'll have to listen to it again to see how the conversation flowed and everything, but I feel like we make a pretty good team, Dale.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, if you ever want a spot on Theo Geeks, I'm willing to kick Russell out, and you're the new co-host. So.
Oh yeah, right on. I might have to do that. Right on. And you know what? Actually, it would be cool. I've had Travis Worth on to discuss things on Cosmic Corner, the more philosophically minded fellow. It would be cool to have you on as well, at least because I know that you have a knack for giving some really pointed pushback that's relevant, and I appreciate that. And like I was telling you before we came on, the kind of the point of that show is to talk about things that perhaps other people aren't talking about, meaning purpose, value, why life is a thing worth doing, trying to combat meaninglessness and suicidality primarily by telling people the reason why the image of God is so important and why that's something that informs everything about you, including your identity. But the thing that we're doing there is actually in real time, live, thinking through things without a script, without an outline, and we're just bouncing things back and forth off of each other. And thinking is hard. Thinking is costly. Thinking is risky. And I don't want a world of sycophants who think that what I think is cool. I want to know where I can improve, what I can correct, and things like that. So it would be cool to have you on for one of those episodes as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Like I said, when I was talking to you privately, I'm happy to be on. So yeah, just you let me know when and where, and I'll be there.
Right on. Well, I'll let you know what we're going to be doing after the zombies episode, and perhaps that'll be the one, huh?
Perfect. I'm there.
Right on. Cool. Well, in the spirit of our brother Tyler Fowler, who is in fact still off on nominal vacation right now for his brand new beautiful daughter, who is doing quite well. Continue to pray for their family, but she is doing quite well right now. But in the spirit of our brother Tyler, who is not here, I'll say good night, God bless, and stay like Christ.